The medical examiner found 3 blunt blows to her skull. There were also slashes on her throat, deep enough to almost sever the head. And a suspect's story that doesn't match the wounds found on the body. You're listening to Dark Side of the Prairies, written and produced by creative media students at Assiniboine Community College, telling the hidden stories of Westman's darker days. What was already a cool day in September of 1945 would turn out to be an even colder night for 16-year-old Pearl Dell. Pearl Dell worked at a farm run by the Owens family on Flea Island near Portage la Prairie. She worked as a housemaid and lived with the Owens family along with a 49-year-old farmhand named Baldwin Jonason. Jonason was an Icelandic immigrant, coming with his parents to the Lake Manitoba Narrows at 2 years old. Jonason had a good reputation as a reliable farmhand. He was also one of the few farmhands at the time to own a car. That came in handy because the help at the Owens farm were lucky enough to get every Saturday and every other weekend off work. Jonason would frequently give Pearl Dell rides into Portage, where she would spend time with her family. That meant her parents' home, her older sister, who was married with her own home nearby, or with her boyfriend. For his part, Jonason would usually go into the town of Langreth, where he grew up. Jonason and Dell seemed to get along well throughout the summer of 1945. But that would prove to be different one fateful night. Sunday, September 9th, 1945. The weather was cloudy and dark, with rain forecast for that night. Dell had promised Mrs. Owens that she would be back by Monday morning for wash day. But now, Monday came and went, with no sign of Dell or Jonason. On Tuesday morning, a neighbor by the name of Jim Wilkinson was leaving his yard in a horse-drawn wagon when he discovered a person laying on the road. It was Jonason, and he seemed to be bleeding. Wilkinson quickly returned home to get his brother and his car. The 2 men came back to Jonason. They discovered he had a blood-soaked bandage on his neck and cut across his left wrist. Jonason told the brothers he had a accident down the road. He told them his car was damaged and that inside they would find Pearl Dell dead. The neighbor and his brother picked up Jonason and placed them in the back seat. They drove to a nearby farm which had a telephone and used it to call the police. The brothers then took Jonason to Portage Hospital. Police arrived at the hospital and asked Jonason to recount the events of the accident. He had claimed that the accident had occurred west of where his car had been found. His head had gone through the windshield. So had Dell's. He told the police that he removed a piece of windshield glass from her neck, but there was no account as to why. It had rained hard Sunday, and the roads were slippery. He had taken a corner too sharply and hit a culvert. She died in his arms without saying a word. Jonason said he somehow got the car back onto the road. He struggled to drive towards Owen's place, but suddenly, he said, he was overcome with weakness. The car ran straight into the ditch. He spent Sunday night, all of Monday, and the early hours of Tuesday morning in the vicinity of the car, crawling to where Wilkinson had found him. Investigators quickly found inconsistencies in Baldwin Jonason's story. A hammer and some broken glass were found in the nearby pasture. Bloodstains were found on the gatepost and in the grass. The detectives discovered a bloodied straight razor. When the car was removed from the ditch, the windshield was found to be broken in 2 places, with most of the glass on the inside of the vehicle. There was no blood on the windshield or on the dash. Jonasson didn't have any injuries to his head that would show he had gone through the windshield. There were only 2 clean cuts, one on his blood-soaked neck and another on his wrist. The investigation now turned to the doctors and the cold steel of the autopsy table to determine the extent of Pearl Dell's injuries and cause of death. Traces of mud were found on the inside of her thighs. There were fine cuts in the toe of one shoe. She had suffered a blow to her forehead from a blunt object, with enough force to knock her out. Her throat had been cut twice by a blade. There were no injuries to her head that would be consistent with striking a windshield. None of the wounds had traces of glass in them. Police returned to the hospital, and Jonasson changed his story. Jonasson told the police, "I didn't quite know what I was saying when I told you before. I had been to Langreth that day, and it was raining. I wanted to get back early. I went up to the pasture. I stopped to open the gate and shut it when I went through." He said, "I went over towards Wes's place, and then the engine stalled. And we sat talking for a while, and she said, 'Let me see your hand.' And then she cut my arm. I then went and cranked the car on. I didn't feel it much at first. I turned the car around, and when I got out of the car to open the gate again, she cut her throat and threw the razor out of my side of the car as I had the door open." Jonasson said, "I then tried to go on with the car, as she died right there. She had kicked out the windshield on her side. As I was turning to go east, I ran into the culvert, and my head went through the windshield on my side, because I wasn't driving right, I guess. That's when I cut my neck on the windshield. I tried to make it to Wes's place, but went into the ditch." The physical evidence did not support either version of the story. Had their heads gone through the windshield, or the windshield been kicked out, most of the glass would not have been recovered inside the car. Small fragments were found inside the pasture where the car had stopped, suggesting that the windshield had been broken in the pasture and not at the gate where Jonasson claimed Dell had kicked out the windshield. The blow to Dell's head occurred before her throat was cut, and it seemed improbable that she could hit herself over the head with a hammer and cut her own throat twice before throwing the razor out of the car. With this evidence, the coroner and the police deemed it enough to arrest Baldwin Jonasson. The trial would range on from November 13th to November 17th. Just 5 days for the courts to decide the innocence or guilt of Baldwin Jonasson. Dr. G.P. Armstrong told the court his injuries were caused by a sharp blade rather than glass from a windshield. Jonasson did not have any other apparent head injuries that would be consistent with his head going through the windshield. Dr. John Kettlewell did the autopsy on Pearl Dell. He testified that she suffered 2 wounds, one on the forehead above the right eye, and the other on the neck. He said she was hit with something heavy and blunt, and the amount of blood lost was due to her jugular being sliced in 2. He couldn't say for sure if Jonasson sexually assaulted her. The Wilkinson brothers testified to their discovery of Jonason on the road and how they helped the police during their investigation. It was Art Wilkinson who discovered the murder weapon while wandering around with the police. Mr. Owens was called to testify about his conversation with Jonason when he visited him in Portage Hospital. Jonason had told Mr. Owens the first version of his story, the same story told to the RCMP. Mr. Owens also mentioned that Jonason kept a hammer in his car, like the one found in the pasture, but he didn't recognize the razor as belonging to Jonason. During the testimony of Sergeant James Newman, Jonason's defense lawyer tried to claim racial profiling on the RCMP. The lawyer asked Sergeant Newman, "In all your experience as a police officer, how often have you prosecuted Icelanders for homicide?" This proved to be a useless move from Jonason's lawyer, as the court decided it had nothing to do with the case. Blood samples were provided, showing Dell's type as type O and Jonason's type as type B. The blood on the razor was Jonason's. No blood was found on the hammer. Jonason's lawyer made a motion. The jury was excused so that Judge Adamson could hear the motion in their absence. Jonason's defense lawyer motioned self-defense. Jonason's lawyer wanted to claim the killing was self-defense, since no motives had been established and only circumstantial evidence was brought forward, with no hard evidence that Baldwin Jonason did kill Pearl Dell. The court dismissed this motion and said that even though the evidence was all circumstantial, he would leave it for the jury to decide for the outcome. Jonason was called to the stand to testify. It was discovered that Jonason was a previous convict. In 1927, Jonason was convicted of assaulting an 8-year-old girl. The prosecutor asked Jonason about his previous charge, making sure the jury understood that he had been convicted for indecent assault of an 8-year-old girl. He then went on to question Jonason about his version of events the night of Pearl Dell's death. Jonason denied that either the hammer or the razor were his, and said that Pearl had committed suicide. The prosecution wanted to expose the improbability of Jonason's versions of the events of the night of Dell's death. Jonason answered most of the questions with, "I don't know," or "I don't remember." There was mud on Pearl's thighs above her dress. How would mud get on her thighs? The prosecution asked Jonason. Did you have your hands on her that night? It was a damning accusation in the form of a question, hitting its mark with the jury regardless of Jonason's quick denial. The jury could now assume a motive and piece together the events of the night for themselves. Jonason had made advances that were resisted. Embarrassed and angry, Jonason chose violence, and after killing Pearl Dell, attempted to kill himself. The judge would sum up the case with these statements. Now the accused is charged that he, Baldwin Jonason, between the 8th and 12th of September 1945, murdered Pearl Dell. I think it is sufficient for our purpose in this case to define murder in this way. If the offender means to cause the death of the person killed, that is murder. It's very simple, isn't it? If the offender means to cause death of the person killed, it is murder. Every homicide is prima facie murder, If one person kills another, prima facie murder. If one person kills another, the law presumes that he intended to do so. Everyone is presumed to intend the natural consequence of his act. No question of drunkenness or provocation or self-defense arises here. You must not only be satisfied with the circumstances or facts are consistent with the guilt, but you also must be satisfied that they are inconsistent with any other rational explanation. With these words from the judge, the jury would deliberate for about an hour. The jury advised the court that when it had reached a unanimous verdict, the final moments were recorded as follows. 2:13 p.m. The jury returns. 2:19 p.m. The judge takes his seat. The clerk of court speaks. Gentlemen of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict? If so, who shall speak for you? Foreman of the jury rises. Clerk of court speaks. How say you? Do you find the prisoner guilty or not guilty? The foreman speaks. Guilty. Jonason's only words to the court after the verdict were, and I quote, "I am not guilty." Jonason was sentenced to death by hanging and would be held in the Headingley jail until his date of death had come. Jonason's lawyer had launched an appeal, but it was denied. Several letters written by members of the Icelandic community and a petition signed by residents of the Narrows area were sent to the Prime Minister and Minister of Justice requesting that Jonason's sentence be commuted to life in prison. The authorities were not swayed by these appeals. 5 months later, Baldwin Jonason was hanged by the neck until dead on Friday, February 8th, 1946, shortly after midnight. He was the first person of Icelandic heritage executed in Canada, and only one of 9 men sentenced to death in Manitoba. Baldwin Jonason, to the very end, claimed he was innocent. The pasture where Pearl Dell lost her life is now a barley field, and the road is seldom traveled. The only witness to the crime was a lone oak tree, known thereafter as the murder oak, which still stands strong and silent to this day. This has been Dark Side of the Prairies, presented by Assiniboine Community College Creative Media students. I've been your host, Drake Forster. And remember, always fear the dark.